There's a reason people fear the ocean at night. It's not just the dark, it's the depth. The idea that beneath you is miles of cold, silent black, and you have no idea what's down there. H.P. Lovecraft once said, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown." Out there, in the middle of the sea, that fear becomes real. You stare out over calm water, hear nothing but the soft splash of waves, and start to wonder what might be watching back. Tonight's stories take us into that stillness, from distant rigs and night boats to lonely vacations far from shore. Each tale begins with something familiar and ends with something else. So grab a blanket, keep your feet tucked in, and stay with me. And hey, if you enjoy what you hear, feel free to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. You're watching Char TV, and I'm Mason. So back in the summer of 2018, me and the family, my wife Clara and our little lad Ollie, decided to splash out on this proper dream holiday. We'd been grinding away in London, me with my finance job pulling long hours, Clara juggling her design work and mum duties, and we'd figured we deserved a break. Booked this posh beachfront hut on a tiny island in the Maldives. Crystal water, white sand, the lot. Cost a bloody fortune, but I'd wanted it perfect, private, quiet, just us and the ocean. Packed our bags, flew out and landed in paradise, or so I'd thought. The hut was unreal, raised on stilts over the shallows, all wood and glass, with a deck stretching right to the water's edge. You could see fish darting under your feet through the floorboards, hear the waves lapping soft all day. Clara had loved it straight off, unpacking her swimsuits and snapping photos, while Ollie ran around in his little bucket hat, chasing crabs on the sand. I'd felt chuffed, proper family man, giving them the best. First day was bliss, swimming, lounging, sipping cocktails the staff brought over from the main resort a mile up the coast. Sun set like a painting, all orange and pink, and I'd reckoned we'd nailed it. That first night, though, something odd cropped up. We just tucked Ollie in, little cot by the window, sea breeze drifting through, and I'd stepped out to the deck for a smoke. This local bloke, some wiry fella, with a boat full of fishing gear, had rowed up close, tying off near our hut. He'd waved me over, voice low like he didn't want it carrying. Told me his name was Ravi, said he'd worked these waters his whole life. Then he'd dropped this weird warning. Sometimes you'd hear crying out on the beachfront, loud and pitiful, like a kid lost in the dark. Said no matter how bad it got, I had to ignore it, keep inside, lock the doors. Reckoned it was some old island tale. Didn't give details, just stared at me hard and rode off. I'd laughed it off to myself. Bloke was probably half mad from the sun, spinning yarns for tourists. Went back in, told Clara about it over a glass of wine, and we'd had a good chuckle. Crying on the beach, load of rubbish. Next morning, Ollie had woken up quiet, which wasn't like him. Usually he'd bounce about, chattering non-stop, but he'd sat there picking at his toast, eyes big. I'd asked what was up, and he'd said he'd seen something in the water last night, out the window, past the deck. Called it a shadow man swimming slow, looking up at him. Clara had cooed, said it was probably a dream or a fish catching the moonlight, and I'd agreed. Told him it was nothing, ruffled his hair, and got us all out for a swim. Didn't think much of it. Kids see all sorts, don't they? Day rolled on fine, sandcastles, snorkeling, Clara sunbathing while I'd chased Ollie through the shallows. Perfect holiday stuff. That night, though, it started. I'd been dozing on the sofa. Big bed was too hot with the humidity, when this sound pulled me awake. Crying, faint at first, drifting in from the water. Sounded like a kid, soft and hiccupy, out past the deck somewhere. I'd sat up, ears pricking, figuring it was Ollie having a nightmare. Checked his cot. He'd been fast asleep, curled up with his stuffed shark. Clara was out too, breathing steady. The crying kept going, louder now, tugging at me. I'd stepped to the window, peered out. Nothing but black waves, moonlight bouncing off them. Reckoned it was some animal, maybe a bird or seal, and went back to the sofa. Took ages to drift off with that noise in the background, but I'd managed. Next day, Ollie had been off again, quiet, clinging to Clara more than usual. Said the shadow man was back, swimming closer, crying this time. I'd brushed it off, told him it was just his imagination running wild. Maybe from Ravi's daft story I'd mentioned at breakfast. Clara had shot me a look, like I'd planted the idea. But we'd moved on, hit the beach, kept busy. Sun was brutal, water perfect, and by afternoon he'd perked up, splashing about like normal. I'd started to relax, figuring it was all in his head, maybe mine too. That crying from the night before had stuck with me though. Too human, too close. Third night, it got worse. We'd had dinner, fish curry from the resort, Ollie's favourite, and settled in. I'd been reading on the deck, Clara inside with a book, Ollie tucked up. Then it came again, crying, loud and raw, right off the hut. Not soft anymore, but this desperate wail, like a kid drowning out there, pleading for help. I'd bolted up, heart thumping, and looked out. Water was calm, moonlight sharp, no boats, no nothing. The sound had swelled, bouncing off the waves, so close I'd sworn it was under the stilts. I'd grabbed a torch, flicked it on, beam cutting through the dark, catching ripples but no source. Clara had poked her head out, asked what I was doing, and I'd told her about the crying. She'd frowned, said she didn't hear it, told me to come inside. I'd listened, locked the door, but it kept going, louder, shriller, until I'd shoved pillows over my ears to sleep. Morning hit and Ollie had been a wreck, pale, eyes red, saying the shadow man was under his window, crying his name. I'd snapped a bit, told him to stop it, that it was nonsense. Clara had pulled me aside, said I was being harsh, that he was scared. I'd felt bad, hugged him, promised we'd have a fun day. Boat trip, ice cream, the works. We'd done it and he'd loosened up. But I'd caught him staring at the water too long, like he'd seen something I hadn't. That local's warning had started gnawing at me. Ignore it, he'd said, but it'd been so damn loud, so real. Fourth night, it turned proper mad. We'd been knackered from the boat, crashed early, Ollie in his cot, Clara beside me in bed. The crying had kicked off around midnight, blasting through the hut like a siren. Not just a kid now, layered, warped, voices piling up, some deep, some shrill, all bawling my name, Ollie's, Clara's. I'd shot up, sweat soaking me, and it had felt like the sound was inside the walls. Clara had heard it too, grabbed my arm, eyes wide, asking what the hell it was. Ollie had woken screaming, saying the shadow man was here, pointing at the window. I'd looked, nothing but black water, waves still, but the crying had mimicked him, his little voice sobbing back, "Daddy, help me," clear as day. I'd grabbed a broom, some daft instinct to fight, and stepped to the deck. Torch in hand, I'd swept the light, caught something then, just for a second. A shape in the shallows, long and dark, thrashing slow under the surface, too big for a fish, too twisted for a man. The crying had spiked, rattling my skull, and it had mimicked Clara next. "James, save me." Her voice, perfect, pleading from the water. I'd yelled at it to shut up, swung the broom like an idiot, but it had kept going, layering our voices over that ancient wail, pulling at me to wade in. Clara had dragged me back, locked us in, and we'd huddled with Ollie, him sobbing into my chest. The thing had stayed out there all night, crying, mimicking, slamming against the stilts till the hut shook. Dawn broke, and it had stopped, silence so sudden it had hurt. We'd packed in a panic, called the resort, got a boat out by noon. Staff had shrugged when I'd told them, said it was old folklore, the weeping deep, something ancient that lured people in with cries, mimicking what you loved. I'd asked Ravi later, found him at the dock. He'd nodded grim, said it had been hunting those waters for centuries, waiting for folks who didn't listen. We'd flown home, shaken to bits. Ollie wouldn't sleep without lights after, kept drawing that shape, long, twisted, eyeless. Clara and I barely talked about it, too raw, too mad. I'd hear it sometimes back in London, faint crying on windy nights, my name in Ollie's voice drifting through the dark. Worst thing that ever happened to me, mate. Thought it was paradise, turned out something was waiting, bawling for us in that bloody water. So this was maybe 3 years ago, back when I was still new on the crew. We were contracted out to inspect this older rig off the coast, a bit southwest of the Shetlands. Real remote job, North Sea, cold, deep, miserable. But the pay was good and the lads I was working with were all right. Proper old school divers, thick necks, heavy accents, footy chat every morning, the lot. You had Big Mike, who used to be Navy, Gav, who chain smoked between dives, Ronan and Stu. Then me, Youngest of the lot, bit quiet, still trying to prove I wasn't soft. Job was routine, nothing fancy. Couple of hours under, check the pipe stability, note corrosion, maybe weld a bit if needed. But on this particular day, things ran behind. Weather turned quick and we had to delay a few hours. By the time we were actually suited up and descending, it was gone 10 p.m. First night dive I'd ever done. The others had done loads, acted like it was no different. You'll be fine, Mike told me, grinning. It's just darker. Darker. Yeah, that doesn't even begin to describe it. Mate, the ocean at night, it's not just black, it's like a bloody void. You drop past the last glimmer of the surface light and suddenly it's just you, your torch, and pitch. It's not like sky dark, it's heavy. Feels like it's pressing on you. We were tethered, obviously. Guide ropes, comms in our helmets, backup torches, professional setup. But still, once you're down there, it's quiet in a way that messes with your head. All you hear is your own breathing and the occasional buzz of the comms when someone checks in. Everything else is just absence. Anyway, we're down there doing the rounds, spread out a bit, staying within sight, lights bouncing off rusted metal, bits of marine growth swaying. I'm tagging along with Ronan, just learning the ropes, when he waves me over to a support column, says there's some damage that needs flagging. I nod, float up beside him, and as I turn, my torch catches movement to my left. I freeze, because it's another diver, suit and all, but no one had said anything about splitting off that way. And this one's just hovering, not working, not welding, just sort of there like he's watching us. Torch pointed downward, not moving. I check communications. No one mentions it. Ronan's still focused on the column. I glance back at the mystery diver, and he's turning now, drifting backward, like he's pulling away into the dark. No face visible behind the mask. Just the glint of the helmet, then nothing. I try to say something. Hey, did someone just... But I don't even finish the sentence. I feel stupid. Maybe it was Gav. Maybe it was Stu moving positions. Water plays tricks with distance, yeah? We finish the dive, get topside. Everyone debriefs in the small galley area on the vessel. I bring it up casual, just sort of go, Oi, were one of you floating near the support column round 20 past? They all frown. Mike goes, nah, we stayed in our sections. I push it. Say I saw someone, plain as day. I describe where. Stu shakes his head. Gav, who's halfway through a cuppa, just says, mate, we were 5 down there. That's when it hits me. 5, me, Mike, Gav, Ronan, Stu. I know that. I knew that. But under that water, I counted 6. Clear as anything. 6 lights, 6 suits, 6 figures. But there were only 5 of us. I never brought it up again after that. Don't think they'd believe me. Maybe they thought I was nervous, seeing things, but I wasn't. I know what I saw. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed, I still picture it. That diver just floating there, not working, not moving, no bubbles, no torch flicker, just watching. And I think, if there was a 6th, what the fuck was it doing down there? And what if it wasn't the first time? Whatever it was, it didn't belong. This happened maybe 6 or 7 years ago. Just me and a buddy John out on a little boat trip we planned for months. Not some big yacht or anything, just a 30-footer that his uncle kept docked in Charleston. Bare bones. But we liked it that way. We were trying to unplug. 2 guys with a cooler of beer, some frozen fish, and the idea we'd drift out a bit. Drop anchor, maybe grill on deck, and watch the stars. Just 2 nights, maybe 3 if the weather held. We left just after sunrise on a Wednesday in mid-June. I remember that clearly because the forecast was perfect and the marina was dead quiet, like everyone else knew to stay on land that day, but didn't say why. You ever get that feeling? Like the world's trying to nudge you away from something but doesn't want to scream it? Anyway, first day was easy. Good wind, calm water. We played some music, cracked a few beers, talked about old dumb stories from high school. By sunset, we were about 20 miles out, totally alone. Nothing but blue for miles. John dropped the anchor and I fired up the little propane grill we had bolted down near the stern. We ate burgers, drank a little more. It was nice. Night fell, moon was thin, stars were bright, everything was quiet. Then the fog started. It didn't roll in, it just appeared. I looked up and it was like someone had drawn a curtain over the sky. You couldn't even see the water past the edge of the boat. Just thick, still grey. I remember turning to John and asking if the weather had changed. He just shook his head, didn't say a word. About an hour in, we realized the air had gone completely still. No breeze, no rocking, no sound of the water slapping the hull. That's when I noticed something strange. The boat had this weird lean to it, not side to side like a wave hit, more like something big moved under us and stayed there. We both looked at each other. Didn't say it out loud, but I could see it on his face. He felt it too, like something deep was watching, not in a ghost story way, not like it had eyes, just this weight, this presence under us, old, indifferent, way too big. We grabbed flashlights, leaned over the edge. I was half hoping it was just a trick of the current, but when I looked down, man, I can't even explain what I saw. It wasn't movement, not really. It was like looking into ink that was almost still, but not quite. Just the faintest shimmer, like something was breathing way down. We tried the engine, wouldn't start. Battery was fine, light still worked, but every time John twisted that key, it just clicked, like the boat itself didn't want to leave. Then we heard the sound. It came from below, deep, hollow, distant, not loud, just long, like a groan stretched out across miles. It wasn't whale song. I know whale song. This was different, thicker, wet, but not water, like metal dragging across bone, muffled by distance. We didn't talk for the rest of the night. I think we both passed out sometime around 4 a.m., just sitting there, staring into the fog. When I woke up, everything was normal. Fog was gone, sky was clear, ocean looked ordinary again. We got the motor running like nothing ever happened. Anchor came up clean, not even a speck of silt on the rope. But our GPS, we were 63 miles from where we dropped anchor. That's not drift, that's movement. We got back to shore by late afternoon. Didn't tell anyone, not even John's uncle. But I haven't been back out since, not really. I've been on lakes, rivers, but not that far out. Because whatever was beneath us that night, it wasn't curious, it wasn't angry. It didn't even care that we were there. And somehow that's what scared me the most. This was back in 2016, off the coast of Whitby. I was doing night runs with a small crew. Me, Steve, Alan, and Craig. Just the four of us. Standard fishing shift. Nothing glamorous, cod, pollock. Sometimes, if we were lucky, a bit of mackerel. You head out around 6, haul through the night, back by sunrise. Done it loads, routine. That night was still, dead still. One of those nights where the sea looks flat as glass, but too flat. You know what I mean? Like the whole ocean's holding its breath. No breeze, no gulls, water black as pitch, sky full of stars, but not much moon. You could hear your own breath over the hum of the deck light. We'd just finished up our last set and were idling, letting the boat drift while Alan rolled a cigarette. I remember sipping my tea, just staring out. That kind of calm where everything feels off, like you're too far from land and the sea knows it. Then Steve spotted it. He pointed off to the port side, said, "Is that one of ours?" We all looked. About 50 yards out, maybe more, there was this buoy. Or at least we thought it was a buoy. But it was tall, too tall, lean. You ever see something in the dark that your brain doesn't quite click with? That's what it felt like we were all trying to find the right shape in it but couldn't. It was swaying, not bobbing, not rocking with the waves. Swaying. And something was on it. Or part of it. Can't be sure. Looked like a figure, kind of. Long, narrow, bent, slightly forward. We thought maybe it was a bird or a man. Maybe some fisherman caught out there and stranded. But it didn't move. Not once. We didn't get closer, but we didn't pull away either. Just floated watching. I don't know what we were waiting for. Maybe for it to wave. Maybe to jump into the water. Something. But it just stood there, facing out. Like it didn't know we were there. Or maybe it did and was ignoring us. I remember thinking, that's not a person. Don't know why. Couldn't see it properly. But its shape, the way it held itself, it just didn't sit right in my chest. Then, swear on my life, it shifted. Just barely, like something rolling under the surface. A ripple that shouldn't have been there. And that shape on the buoy, it sort of tilted, like it had noticed us, like it was listening, and my stomach just dropped. I didn't even say anything. None of us did. We just looked at each other, then Alan flicked off the deck light. Dead silence. We turned the boat, slow, no engines at first. Didn't want to make noise. When we finally powered up and pulled away, I looked back once, just once, and it was still there, in the dark, not moving. Back on land, nobody said much. Steve didn't sleep that day, said he couldn't stop picturing it, just swaying in the black like it was waiting for something. We still don't know what it was. Could have been nothing, could have been a trick of the light, or maybe there's something older out there, something that's been drifting longer than any of us, and maybe sometimes, on the quiet nights, it stands real still and watches the boats go by. So, mate, I've got to tell you this one. It's the story my grandpa used to hit me with whenever I'd pester him for something scary. Proper gives you the shivers. Picture us sat there, me a lad, him in his old armchair, cigarette glowing, eyes sharp like he's seeing it all again. Grandpa was Arthur Davies, born 1920, East End born and bred. The England he'd fight for, die for, proper proud of what it stood for back then. He'd spin this tale from his days in the war, World War II, Royal Navy, 1943, and I'd hang on every word. Don't know if I buy it even now, but fuck me, the way he'd tell it, that look in his old eyes, scared and steady. You'd believe he believed it. He'd been 23, serving on HMS Bulldog, a Hunt-class destroyer, 280 feet of steel, twin 4-inch guns, built to hunt U-boats and shepherd convoys through the North Atlantic. This was late 43, peak of the Battle of the Atlantic, Jerry subs tearing into anything that moved. Bulldog had been out with a merchant fleet, 20 ships crawling from Liverpool to Canada, slow and vulnerable, easy meat for torpedoes. Grandpa was a gunner's mate, up on deck half the time, freezing his bollocks off in the damp, sea black as coal, wind slicing through his oilskin. Crew was tight, 40 lads, proper brothers, the kind you take a hit for and they'd do the same. Skipper was Lieutenant. Commander Evans, a hard-nosed bastard who'd kept 'em sharp, but even he'd been on edge that run. U-boats had sunk 3 ships the week before, depth charges booming like thunder every other night. This one night, he'd always start slow, voice dropping low. It'd been pitch dark, no moon, just a scatter of stars barely cutting the black. Sea had been dead calm, flat as a pane of glass, which unnerved 'em more than any gale. They'd been on high alert, lookouts posted fore and aft, ASDIC pinging for subs, every groan of the ship making your hair stand up. Grandpa'd been up near the forward gun, cigarette cupped against the wind, sharing a flask of rum with his mate Tommy. Scouse lad, quick with a laugh, crack shot with the 4-incher. Rest of the crew'd been dotted about, some below in the mess, some on watch, all knackered but wired, waiting for that sonar blip or the white streak of a torpedo. Then it had kicked off, soft at first, he'd said, a splash you'd barely catch unless you were listening close. He'd heard it, nudged Tommy, asked if he'd clocked it too. Tommy'd nodded, said it had sounded near, port side, maybe 30 yards off. They'd leaned over the rail, peering into the dark. Nothing but water, still and oily, catching starlight like a mirror. Lookout hadn't shouted, ASDIC stayed quiet, but that splash had hit again, harder, like something big breaking surface. Grandpa'd figured it was a fish, told Tommy to quit twitching, but his gut had started to knot anyway. Few minutes on, Tommy'd grabbed his arm, proper gripped it, face gone tight, and pointed. Out there in the black, a shape had bobbed up, head and shoulders pale against the water, floating dead still. Grandpa'd stopped cold, said it'd looked like a bloke, just sitting there, not swimming, not sinking, slap bang in that endless dark. They'd called for the watch, leading seaman Harris, wiry sod with binoculars, who'd swung round, glassed it and swore under his breath. Said it was a man, no doubt, bareheaded, no lifeboat, no wreckage, just there, miles from fuck all. Skipper'd come up quick, barking to slow engines, get a light on it. Thought it'd been a survivor, some poor bugger from a sunk ship. They'd swung a searchlight over, big 24-inch beam, cut through the night like a blade, and it had pinned him. Grandpa'd said he'd been pale as a corpse, skin slick, hair dark and wet, plastered flat. No uniform, no gear, just a man floating upright, arms loose at his sides, close enough now, 20 yards off, drifting slow toward Bulldog. Then this sound had started, low, guttural, not words, more a hum rolling off the water, deep enough to shake your ribs. Crew'd gone silent, staring, some muttering prayers, Catholics mostly, clutching their beads. Grandpa'd felt it hit him, that hum sinking into his chest, making his hands itch to move. Tommy'd whispered it might have been a kraut diver, some sabotage job, but Harris had shot that down. No frogman to be out here, no sub on scope, no bloody sense to it. Skip had ordered a boat lowered, standard rescue drill, but nobody'd moved, just watched that bastard float closer. Light had caught his face then. He'd turned, slow as death, and Grandpa'd said it had been off. Too long, jaw hanging loose, eyes big and black, no whites, just holes staring back. The hum had spiked, his name, Arthur, growling out clear as a bell like it had known him forever. Crew'd lost their nerve. Tommy'd stumbled back cursing. Harris had fumbled the binos, shouting to douse the light. Grandpa'd stayed rooted, torch in hand, little everyday job he'd kept in his pocket, and flicked it on, beam wobbling. Thing had shifted, head tilting further, neck stretching wrong, like it had had too many joints. Water'd rippled round it, slow and thick, and that hum had turned sharper. Tommy's name next, Thomas. Then Harris's layering up, pulling at 'em all. Skip had roared to hold fast, but Grandpa'd seen it move, arms lifting slow, hands clawing air, long fingers webbed faint, glistening wet. They'd swung the light off, but it had kept coming. 15 yards now, hum turning to a moan, deep and old, like the sea itself groaning. Grandpa'd said it had looked bigger, shoulders hunching, head lolling side to side, water bubbling round it like it had been boiling slow. Crew'd started shouting, some at the guns, some below for depth charges, but Skip had held 'em, said no firing till they'd known what it was. Torch had caught it again, face splitting wider, mouth a black gash, teeth glinting jagged, not human. More fish, more beast. It had lunged then, half out the water, arms thrashing, body long and twisted, scales flashing dark under torn skin. Grandpa'd yelled, first time he'd broken, he'd said. Torch dropping, beam spinning wild. Thing had hit the hull, hard, a thud that had rocked 'em, metal groaning. Moan had turned to a screech, splitting the night, names gone, just raw noise clawing their skulls. Tommy'd grabbed a rifle, fired blind, crack echoing, water splashing, but it had ducked under, shadow streaking below. Skip had screamed full ahead, engines roared, Bulldog lurching, and they'd peeled out, wake churning white. It had followed, it'd been fast, shape darting under, slamming the hull again, screech fading slow, like it had been testing 'em. They'd run flat out till dawn, grey light creeping up, sea turning slate, no sign of it. Crew'd been knackered, pale, staring at the water like it had bite. Grandpa'd said they'd never logged it. Skip had called it a trick of the night, exhaustion. No proof, but dents in the steel nobody'd explained. Tommy'd reckoned it had been a drowner, old tale from his nan, half man, half sea, luring ships to crack on rocks. Grandpa'd never named it, just sat quiet after, hands shaking round his rum. They'd made the convoy run, lost 2 ships to U-boats later, but that night had stuck worse. Grandpa'd come home 1945, medals and all, built a life, but he'd tell me that story with those eyes. Old, hard, fucking terrified. Said it had been the worst thing he'd seen, worse than bombs or subs. Something down there, not a man, waiting in the dark. I'd hear it in his voice, mate. Ocean at night, crew ready to die for each other, and that thing, ancient and wrong, calling his name. Don't know if it's true, but I'd see him stare out sometimes like he'd heard it again, drifting off the Thames. There's something about the ocean that lingers long after the story ends. Maybe it's the quiet. Maybe it's knowing we've only seen a fraction of what's really out there. But after a night like this, I wouldn't blame you for hesitating the next time you're near the water. Thanks for spending some time with me. If you enjoyed the stories, go ahead and like the video. It really helps. And if you want more tales like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Until then, sleep well. This is Char TV and I'm Mason.